we had left off talking about Spanish Baroque art. Oh, Tracy, I've got your midterm at the end of class. Be sure to pick it up, okay? Remember, you found those errors in my math, so be sure you grab that before you take off. We had left off talking about Baroque art in Spain, and we were looking at the most prominent artist in Spain, Velázquez, and who spent most of his career as a court painter for the King of Spain, Philip IV. And here we see a portrait that Philip commissioned of his daughter, Margarita, and we see Velázquez apparently in the act of painting her, right? Although we're not sure exactly what he's painting, he clouds that in mystery, right? But we do see Philip and his wife, Mariana, in the background in the mirror. They are both members of the Habsburg family. The Habsburg family had been interbreeding, right? First cousins often, in order to shore up the dynasty, in order to bring much of Europe under its power. And part of Europe that came under its power was Flanders. Now, we talked about Flanders before. This is that area that's today primarily Belgium, right? This is where Van Eyck worked. This is where Bosch worked. This is where Bruegel worked, Matthijs, right? That whole group from Flanders. And the Habsburg family, through this intermarriage that I was just talking about, had married into the ruling family of the Low Countries and brought that under their control, and remained so into the beginning of the 17th century. So Flanders is often referred to as the Spanish Netherlands. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But what I wanted to point out is that Rubens spent time as a diplomat as well as a painter. Peter Paul Rubens did. He spoke like 5 languages fluently, right? And was apparently incredibly gregarious and charming and learned, and had been sent on diplomatic mission working for the local regents in Flanders, the appointed leaders under the Habsburgs, had been sent by them to almost every other country in Europe. So Rubens spends time as a diplomat working in England, working in France, and he's even dispatched to Madrid in Spain as a diplomat to the court of Philip IV. In fact, the pictures on the back wall of Las Meninas are paintings by Rubens. And he and Velázquez met at one point. There's this amazing story of the two of them walking through the Royal Picture Gallery and looking at the Titians. And Rubens explaining to Velázquez what's great about these pictures. Rubens was older by about 20 years. Right? There's also this wonderful anecdote about him. He's there late for dinner as the court diplomat, and somebody sent up to grab him, come down for dinner, and they find Rubens painting in his the suite. And the court flunky, and he speaks Spanish, right? Rubens speaks all these languages. The court servant who comes to get Rubens says, "Oh, the diplomat dabbles in painting." And Rubens looks down his nose at him and says, "No, the painter dabbles in diplomacy." And this really is this amazing quote, right? He's this man of jack of all trades. So he has close connections to Spain because Spain controls Flanders, right? And he ends up working as court painter for the Spanish appointed leaders of Flanders. And while he's in Spain on diplomatic mission, he paints the pictures on the back wall in Velázquez's Las Meninas. And Velázquez includes them not only because they're allegories of artists challenging the gods, but he also includes them because they're Rubens. And Rubens becomes pretty much the most important painter in really all of Europe during the Baroque period. Okay. So this is our map, right? I think I've told you guys before, the only way I ever learned geography was through art history. It gave me something hanging on to, right? So we're talking about that area in pink there, the Spanish Netherlands, right? Sometimes called Flanders, these days called Belgium, but Belgium wasn't a country till the 19th century, and it is ruled by Spain, which you can see is quite a ways away. Right? It's a fragmented realm. Okay? And Rubens is active in the city of Antwerp, the most important economic hub in all of the Spanish Netherlands, in all of Flanders. And that is the city he calls home. However, for 10 years, between 1600 and 1609, Rubens had been in Italy. He'd gone to Rome and traveled from Rome to Naples, Genoa, various other cities in Italy, right? And he's hoping, I think, to make a career there. It looks like he's kind of there to stay. And he's picking up some pretty major commissions. He does the high altar in the Jesuit church in Rome, for example. I didn't bring it in to show it to you. But he's there when Caravaggio's alive. He's there when Caravaggio's working. And what's absolutely fascinating about Rubens is that while he is every bit as dramatic as Caravaggio, he doesn't seem to be very much influenced by Caravaggio. And if we compare the two, yes, they both focus on drama, but Rubens does it differently. We don't have the stage lighting and the deep shadowed darkness that picks out the figures highlighted in the... That's not there for Rubens. Certainly there's bright light, but it's not Caravaggio light. And another thing that should come immediately to mind is it's significantly more colorful. A much, much broader range of colors than we saw in any Caravaggio. None of this earth tones orbiting around brown, which is the hallmark of Caravaggio's works and those of his followers. At the same time, Rubens's work is incredibly dramatic. Right? Now, it's a triptych, so the wings fold. It's an altarpiece. But we're going to focus primarily on the center panel. Before we do, I'm going to point to some things in the sides, and then they'll disappear. So on the left is John with the Virgin Mary, right, in the left-hand panel. We see other women mourning. The Virgin has gone pale. We've seen her faint a few too many times, right? So she looks like she's about to faint. John's putting his comforting hand on hers, right? Right-hand panel, we see the Roman centurions. I love that horse. Rubens is a great animal painter, like maybe one of the best ever. He had access to the royal zoo and was doing these animal studies from life. So there we see the Roman centurion directing the torture of Christ, the death of Christ. And behind him, after we look back behind the baton, right, we see two other men, the two thieves, that will be crucified on either side of Christ, and there's another Roman centurion back there directing, right? So that all adds to the central scene. It doesn't continue across. You'll notice that the figures that are cut off in the center don't continue in the sides, but it kind of seems to, right? They seem related, okay? Now let's look at the center panel. There we go. How does Rubens make it dramatic? He's not using Caravaggio techniques. What does he do that makes it incredibly dramatic, that heightens the sense of drama? Sorry? The bodies, my goodness, yes. About the hunkiest Jesus you're ever going to see. But beyond him, look at the guys that are raising the cross. Right? This is not an actual crucifixion scene. This is the moment before the crucifixion begins, right? So they've nailed him to the cross, and they're now raising the cross. I'm going to thump it into the post hole so it'll stand up straight and shimmy, right? Keep it upright. So this is the moment when they're lifting up Jesus. And if Jesus is built like that, Rubens loves massive bodies, both for men and for women. But unlike Michelangelo's, women look like women. They don't look like, muscular men with breasts, right? Well, Jesus looks like that. Look at the bodies of the guys that are lifting more so, right? He had just got back, like this is painted as soon as he gets back from Rome. So in 1609, you know this from the worksheet, in 1609 he comes back from Rome because his mom is sick, right? And he's going to come back because he's a good son, right? Dutiful son. So he comes back, and as soon as he gets back, he gets this major commission for an altarpiece for one of the churches in Italy. Okay? So he's just had 10 years of studying art in Rome, and yeah, Michelangelo he's been looking at, right? Ancient Greek sculpture he's been looking at. We can trace the body of Christ directly back to a Greek sculpture, right? He's been studying Italian art for the better part of 10 years, and he's assimilated that into his style. And so the musculature is Michelangelo-like, maybe even more so, right? Because if you look at, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys, 7 lifting the cross, right? 7 different people have been needed to lift the cross, and none of them are scrawny. Right? These are massive, massive people. I'm particularly fond myself of the bald guy, right? I like this idea that, bald people are bad, right? This joke is kind of falling flying more. The first Indiana Jones movie, who's seen it? Anybody? Indiana Jones, it's the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay, he has this fist fight with a big bald Nazi on a plane, and he looks like that guy, right? Because bald people are just bad, right? And here he kind of almost looks like Satan. His ears look kind of like almost like they're pointed, That's to show that he's evil because he's tormenting Christ, right? So, yeah, the musculature, and I'll show details in just a second, is one of the ways in which Rubens heightens the drama, right? All of that stretching and grunting to lift Christ. Other ways in which it becomes dramatic. Other things that he's done. From design classes, one of the things they tell us in design classes, right, if you take a basic design class, is that horizontals and verticals tend to cancel each other out and become very static. So if you have a work of art that's just all, it doesn't really move around a lot, it's not very moving. Rubens builds this on a diagonal, an incredibly strong diagonal that runs from the lower right corner all the way to the upper left. And in fact, Caravaggio does something similar with the light, right? Coming in at an angle, as all of his light does as an angle, helps to actify the composition, right? Make it more active. Activate, that's the word I want. Activate the composition, right? So Rubens is going that way as well. The other things that we see here that we see often in Baroque art is also an attempt to engage your other senses. To make it a work of art that you look at, that is in fact pleasing to look at. He's terrific in sort of adding colors together to work in groups, but also a work of art that maybe you can smell. In particular, that you can hear the rustling leaves behind Christ. Right? The spaniel in the lower left corner. Right? Maybe even taste. It's sweaty, it's dirty. Right? All of these elements add to this engaging sense of drama. Rubens is particularly Baroque because we've seen these elements are elements of being Baroque. Look at all of the places where he emphasizes touch. Right? The way in which these figures have to try to come close to touching Christ to raise him. Right? Even little things, the blood running down his arms, dripping on the white loincloth just a little bit, right by where the man in red has touched it. Still, you'll notice that Christ is looking up toward heaven. I always irreverently call this like touchdown Jesus, because he's rocky at the top of the steps, right? He's jumping up and down in the end zone in a way. There's a sense with this that it's, yes, he's suffering, but there's a way that Rubens is showing us the future beyond this. Figures down in the dirt, the guy behind the cross, right, and his speed skater thighs pushing that cross upward, and then the legs of our bald guy behind him. right? All of these things are about touch. And of course, then there's the ideas of sound. And we've seen again and again how Baroque artists do this, right? Use your other senses to add to the sense of drama in the work. Rubens, like Bernini, used that program of prayer that Ignatius Loyola had recommended, called the spiritual exercises, where you try to imagine yourself actually there, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, seeing, right? Rubens did this as well. He was an incredibly devout man. The figure behind the bald guy is Saint Longinus. He's the one who pierced Christ's side with a lance on the crucifixion. And when he did, the blood ran down the lance. He wiped his eyes with it, and he was miraculously healed of blindness and converted. Saint Longinus here is a self-portrait of Rubens. Rubens is helping to lift the cross. And we can see this as part of his imagining himself there. But we can also see it as Rubens' acknowledgement that Christ's death on the cross is our fault. We helped raise the cross. Right? So this is really theatrical. It's really Baroque. It's really over the top. And this is what Rubens is particularly good at. Right? Is this high drama, muscular figures. Now we have got a really terrific Rubens. Who's working on this? Who's got the Daniel? I know somebody does. Are you afraid to fess up? Do you not know you're working on it? Someone's working on it. Daniel in Lion's Den. Rubens. Well, maybe I'm wrong. I thought somebody picked this up. Okay. Maybe somebody had it as a second one. One of the largest pictures in the National Gallery, actually. And you can see that same thing we were talking about. When Rubens picks up a religious image, first he renders his male figures as these Michelangelo-like muscular dudes, right? But also then he heightens the drama. Like Caravaggio's right up close. Not close, you are those lions, right? Frighteningly close. And those lions are life-size, right? That's how big this picture is. The lions are life-size. And Daniel is hyper-muscular, the same sort of body type we see in the Elevation of the Cross, right? At least the one for Christ, not necessarily the evil henchmen around the sides, right? Now, the story of Daniel. Who knows the story of Daniel? Does anybody want to fess up that they do know? Walk us through the story of Daniel. No? He was a prophet, Old Testament prophet. And he was being held captive in Persia by Nebuchadnezzar. And he kept prophesying about the Hebrew God. Right? Nebuchadnezzar does not like this. And he decides to have Daniel killed. So what he does is he keeps this cave full of hungry lions. Right? He starves them. And then when he's got someone he wants to execute, get rid of, right? He throws them in there. Closes the opening at the top. Lions gobble them up because they're starved. Right? And you can see around the front all the bones and the skull and the jawbone of other people who have met their fate in Nebuchadnezzar's lion den. Right? Daniel is thrown in there, and because of his faith, the lions are tamed. And Nebuchadnezzar leaves him in there for 3 days, rolls a stone over the top so he can't get out. And comes back 3 days later, hoping to look down and see the bloody remains, right? More bones. They roll the stone away, and there is Daniel, unscathed, right? And what we're seeing here is the moment of high drama. The stone has been rolled back, right? Daniel's looking up. Man of prayer, a man of faith, has been saved. Right? And the lions, which are supposed to be hungry and evil, have mostly been tamed. They certainly haven't hurt him at all. Right? Now, Rubens' idea here is to get across that idea of the wild animal tame. And so two of them in the right foreground, the ones that are almost closest to you, look particularly dangerous. Right? One of them looks right out at us and snarls. Rubens loves doing that, putting animals in that look straight out at you, because it helps to engage, And it's almost like they're playing with each other. My dogs do that. The one's got his paw out and he's batting the back of the other one. Come on, let's fight, right? And the other one is not a happy lion, right? But the other one's right under his foot. It almost looks like he's tickled it, right? Like he's been petting it or something with his toe. Because it's purring, It's asleep. And in the back, they're all just, these guys, arms are crossed, right? In the background on the left, looking over at his friend. The other one behind is sleeping. The other one down below. One up here, I don't think he's roaring so much. I think he's yawning, look, there's daylight, right? So Rubens has sort of worked it out for high drama, right? And given us this range of lines that are all phenomenally. Now, if we go back to the legend, right? Daniel and the lion's den. The fact that he was thrown into this pit for 3 days with a stone rolled over the opening, and then 3 days later, the stone is rolled away and he is alive. Does that sound like something else to you, like an analogy for something else? Jesus, right? Put in the grave, 3 days, stone over the opening. When the stone is rolled away, he has risen. Daniel was looked at by theologians throughout the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and beyond as an analogy for Jesus. And Rubens presents him that way, looking up toward the opening. In fact, the body looks so much like Christ, doesn't it? He's just a clean-shaven version. Yeah.
Is the red here like using it as he suffered?
Sorry?
The red color that he
well, except that he didn't suffer. That's, I guess, the thing. But yes, definitely, I think the red, for Rubens, the red is there as a great color choice because it heightens the sense of threat in a way, right? Because it's the color of blood. As a compositional choice, it heightens the threat. But I don't know if it makes much in the way of a narrative difference, right? I don't think we're sort of, is it the robe he threw off, or is it just a red color accent that he's thrown in? Yeah. So again, we get the sleeping lions in the foreground. Each one of them looks like, almost like he's reacting to you. It's like, oh, look, fresh meat, right? Somebody else is in here with us. And these two in the corner, and so incredibly well drawn, right? Such good illustrations of animals, and these guys in the back, right, are absolutely fantastic. And like I said before, Rubens was able to do a number of animal studies because he had access to the zoo, the Royal Zoo in Antwerp. And here's a drawing of a lion that he used for this. Drawn directly from life while he was in the Royal Zoo. Really terrifically done from life, right? Now, like I said, the lions are life-size. This is a massive picture, right? A good 15 feet across the base or so. Rubens did this just for fun. It wasn't a commissioned work of art. Every work of art we've seen so far has been, well, not everyone, but most of them have been works of art that somebody pays for up front, and then the artist decides to make it. This one, Rubens seems to have done specifically just because he likes painting, right?
So, if the lions are life size, is there like a reason as to why he made Danielson bigger than them?
Yeah, probably super heroic, right? Yeah, you can probably almost answer your own question that way, right? Is that, yeah, he's super heroic, right? That he's that much bigger than there. Although when was the last time you stood next to him?
He's bigger than us.
A little bit they are a little bit bigger than us, aren't they? Yeah. Maybe he never saw them with somebody sitting next to them, right? I mean, you draw them in the zoo. Do you have a chance to see them with somebody standing there with them? Why not? That's a good question. They are too. He's way big, right? But I think that's part of it to focus on him, right? I mean, because he is, after all, the main focus of the picture, right? So let's go back to this thing, and this is kind of an interesting picture because he made it for himself, and he still owned it 2 years after it was painted. And we know this because he wrote a letter to a diplomat in London. We talked about the fact that Rubens is a diplomat, right? He's going all over Europe, traveling, and he'd been to London before. Did some works. In fact, there's still some Rubens paintings in Whitehall Chapel, or Whitehall Palace in London. Some Rubens ceiling paintings by Rubens there. And while there, he had met other diplomats, and one of them, he admired his collection. And he's trying to trade some of his paintings for some works of art for his own collection. And this guy named Dudley Carleton, you don't need to worry about that too much, right? This English diplomat has this huge collection of ancient art, Greek sculptures, coins, busts of philosophers, and Rubens wants some of them. He wants to buy them from them. But instead, he offers them this picture. So I got this Daniel, right, sitting around the house, 15 feet across, taking up room in the corner. Why don't I trade this to you for 4 busts, 10 coins, and some medals? And Carleton said, sure. And Rubens in the letter, and this will lead us to our next artist, said, by the way, I painted every inch of it myself. And he had to say this because everybody knew that Rubens had a huge studio with other artists helping him on the paintings, especially in the larger ones, right? He would come up with the design, and these different specialists would come in and work on different parts of it, and then he would sort of finish it up. And this was common practice. This was not like he was being a snake or something like that, right? This was normal. But he tells Carleton, I painted this one entirely myself. Right? That should add to its value. It's not got some of my students' bits in the back, right? So the reason I'm saying that is twofold. One, it's interesting that Rubens, he has this monster house. It's still there. You can go visit it in Antwerp. Go see Rubens' house. But two, he ran this incredibly large studio with artists working for him. And one of the artists that was working for him was Anthony van Dyck, right? And Van Dyck and Rubens are really the two primary artists in Flanders in the Baroque period. And Van Dyck was not just a pupil, but was a shop assistant. And he's particularly good with fabrics, he's particularly good with human faces, and he seems to have helped Rubens on a number of his compositions. Right? Before breaking out on his own for an independent career right around 1620. And when he breaks out on an independent career, he decides to focus primarily on portraits. And the reason for this is that Rubens has most of the market locked up. He's too popular to try to rival. Right? So Van Dyck goes out on his own, does portraits. Isabella Brandt here, wearing her Sunday best, with a feather duster to fan herself and a rose in her hand. This is Rubens' wife. She's actually his first wife. He married twice. Right? The second wife was like 14, and he was like 41 when he married her. No, more like 51 when he married her. Kind of creepy. But she shows wife numero uno, right, in their garden. This is Rubens' backyard, with architecture designed by Rubens for his garden. Like I said, it's still there. You can go visit it, right? This is where she's seated in Van Dyck's portrait. Right? Notice, by the way, the red curtain pulled back we saw as an artifice in other portraits in the Baroque period. Same thing here. So Van Dyck is breaking free from Rubens, right? from his studio, trying to forge out on his own, make his own career. And he's slowly but surely realizing that Antwerp, even though it's a major bustling port, doesn't really have room for two people so closely associated with each other. And he decides instead that he should go somewhere else to make his career. And what he decides to do is move to England and spends the majority of the last 10 years of his life working in London. How does he get there? He paints this first. This is huge. This is another spec work, right? He did this just on a whim. It's again massive. This is the better part of 12 feet tall. Right? Baroque is the period of huge. Right? Remember the very beginning of the first Dan Brown movie? Da Vinci Code? Right? The painting falls on the guy. Right? It's a Caravaggio, by the way. Right? Falls on the guy. And it's this painting that's like 16 feet across, you know? Which, by the way, would have killed him. Right? It was so heavy. Right? So Baroque is really the period of huge. Right? So here Van Dyck decides, I'm going to try and get a job with the King of England. So he paints this massive picture of a medieval regent, Rinaldo and Armida. Just on spec. And he has it sent across the North Sea to London. With a note saying, I'd like to come and work for you. I'd like a job as court painter. Now, we haven't looked at any English art yet, have we? There's not a lot of homegrown talent. Well, we did a little bit. No, we didn't. I skipped it. There's not a lot of homegrown talent in England. Right? There are mostly foreign artists working there. And Van Dyck knows this. Right? And decides he's going to now try to get a job. Right? So he paints this picture, which is just, for my money, something in Baltimore. One of the great pictures in the Mid-Atlantic region. It's over the top. It's very Baroque. Look at how dramatic it is, right? Rinaldo is sleeping. Armida is leaning in, right? And we have all of these nymphs and putti floating around. But as she comes in on that, look at the diagonal that runs across the composition. Like Rubens had done, right? Lower right to upper left. You can sort of cut the composition in half. But then she goes into it with that amazing drapery coming out toward us, right? As she swoops in. Everything is sort of wrapped up in itself and incredibly dramatic. And the story is that, I got to get this straight, right? The story is that, a medieval fantasy from the First Crusade, the Muslims had sent Armida to a Christian camp to cast a spell on the great knight Rinaldo, the Christian knight Rinaldo. And the spell is that she's supposed to make him fall asleep, and then she can kill him, and then the Crusaders will be defeated. Right? That's the story. And what happens is, as soon as she casts a spell on him, she looks down on sleeping Rinaldo, and she immediately falls in love with him. Right? Again, it's a fantasy, right? And is converted to Christianity because of her love, her physical love for Rinaldo, which is only people in the Middle Ages could make this sort of junk up, right? But that's the story that we see. So here's the moment when she's cast him asleep, right? The wreath of flowers around his neck. And she's now looking down onto his face and is at the very moment when she's falling in love, right? Now, like I said, he painted this for himself, if you will, and decided to use it as a way to get the support of the King of England for his works. He sends it off to King Charles I, who we'll see in just a second. And as a showpiece, he's trying to show Charles I how good a painter he is. Here's a famous Rubens that he painted for the Queen of France when he was in Paris on diplomatic mission. And you can see that the woman in the water looks like the Rubens women down here. What's the face, Peyton? They're kind of heavy-set, aren't they? We still use the word Rubensian for heavy-set women. That's a term you'll see sometimes in literature for But yeah, it's over the top, right? The figures are, and his women are as over the top as his men are, but in a different way. Van Dyck picks up on that and gives us the woman holding the sea nymph in the lower right corner, holding that piece of paper, gesturing out toward us, right? I think that Van Dyck's women are significantly more attractive than Rubens's are. Rubens's tend to be a bit too lumpy in a way, right? At the same time, he rearranges elements from a Titian picture, right? This is one of the Titian pictures that went next to our Bellini, the Feast of the Gods that we saw, and you can see the same sort of swirling and swooping figures moving through. What Van Dyck is trying to do when he shows this to Charles I of England is to show him what he's going to get, right? The greatest court painter you could ever want, you can get if you hire me, right? So there's a close-up of Armida with Rinaldo. The figure in the foreground is holding music that they're playing as they put him to sleep. Again, a Baroque picture that you can smell and hear and touch, or at least imagine that you can touch, right? There's our sleeping Christian knight with the wreath of flowers that is going to be placed around him as a symbol of love. So again, Van Dyck is using various other works of art to put himself forth as the greatest painter to King Charles I. And here's Charles I. He's the court painter to Charles. Almost every portrait of Charles that you see is painted by Anthony Van Dyck. What was that English thing that was also popular on PBS last 3 or 4 years? Set in an English manor. Did you guys, my wife was watching, I can't remember the name of it. Who said that? Downton Abbey, exactly right. There's an Anthony Van Dyck behind the dinner table in Downton Abbey, one of his portraits of King Charles, which to this day is still in the royal collection, right? So there's Charles, painted by Van Dyck, hires him, spends the last 10 years, 1630 to 1640, working for Charles. We have a portrait down at the National Gallery by Van Dyck of Charles's wife, Henrietta, with one of her court attendants, Geoffrey Hudson, who was a dwarf. We've seen in the Baroque period lots of courts with dwarfs, right? And this is certainly one of them, another of them. She is the French daughter of Marie de Medici, the Queen of France, and her husband, King Henri IV. So she is linked to the French dynasty and has been married to Charles out of diplomacy. She never learns to speak English. She and Van Dyck become incredibly close friends because he can speak French, as well as Flemish, as well as English. He painted her more than 25 different times, is his role as court painter. Now, in this particular picture, we can see his strength as a colorist. The yellow of the fabric on the right, the gold, the blue of her dress, the red of little Geoffrey Hudson, the different textures of these three things. Again, the Baroque appeal to touch, the silk of her dress, the velvet of Geoffrey Hudson's clothing. Sorry, the light? Yeah, very much so. Picks that up very, very well. Behind her is a potted orange tree. Now that's there probably for two different reasons. One, she actually introduced orange trees to England. Right? She was instrumental in bringing them from Europe to England. They're obviously not indigenous to England. But over and above that, as a kind of fruit that's come from the south up north to England, the potted orange tree can be seen as a symbol for her. She too is a transplant out of place. Now, little Geoffrey Hudson was 14 years old at the time, right? A dwarf. They called him Lord Minimus, right? The little lord. And he was particularly known for being very, very witty as a court gesture. And he's shown here with his own pet, the monkey named Pug. He had been knighted by the court. Not that that excuses them keeping dwarves as entertainment. Right? And Henrietta is very nicely dressed. She has these ribbons tied to the front of her beautiful blue gown. And Van Dyck has gone to great trouble not only to show the fabric of the gown and the gold borders sewn into it, but also those amazing ruffs on her sleeves and the lace around her shoulders. Right? Incredibly wealthy gown. But what's interesting about her is that she's nicely dressed, but she's not dressed like a queen. She's not shown in her royal gown. And in fact, the vast majority of portraits of both Henrietta and her husband Charles do not show them in royal costume. But instead, we see them as aristocrats, cultured people of the upper classes. And that's exactly how she appears here. So instead of a crown, she's wearing that great big hat with the feather in it. Instead of a royal gown, an aristocratic, beautiful gown. Her crown is there, but it's been tucked off to the side. And Van Dyck paints it to be the same color as the gold fabric. So it almost gets visually lost over to the right. She's depicted not as queen, even though she is the queen. In the same way, her husband, Charles, in this probably the most famous of his portraits, does not appear as a king. There's nothing in the things he carries or in the things that he wears that says that he's king. Right? It's only the fact that they both appear as cultured people of the upper classes. Now, there's a reason for this. Right? Charles believed in the political idea of absolute monarchy. Okay, do you know that term from poli-sci? High school, right? The absolute monarch, one who is born to power that is never questioned, right? And if you are born to power, you will be in power until the day you die, right? No one can take that from you. And as a believer in absolute monarchy, you ought to think that his pictures would show him fur, crown, scepter, gold stuff everywhere, but they don't. And the point of the pictures is that it's not the crown that makes them royal. Right? It's they deserve it. It's their culture that makes them deserve the royalty that they have. And this relates directly to the political science of the day, that there was a social contract where individuals in a country give up their rights to governance to their leaders. But these leaders deserve to govern, deserve to rule, because they are of outstanding character. This is exactly how Charles and his wife appear to us, as people of outstanding character, not as people who simply get the crown, but people who have deserved it. Right? Now we have a few seconds left here. We got about 6 or 7 minutes, so we're going to move on to our last country for the Baroque, which is Holland. So we have been looking at the Spanish Netherlands, right? Flanders, which you can see on the map here, the bit in pink there. Governed by Spain, independent from the North Netherlands, right? The United Provinces of the Netherlands, which were Holland. And here's a bit of political history. During the time that Van Dyck and Rubens are painting, Flanders is at war. Holland and what is today Belgium, Holland and the Spanish Netherlands are fighting with each other in the 80 Years' War. This broke out around the time of Bruegel, Peter Bruegel, right? And continued all the way to 1648. It was literally 80 years of fighting. There was one brief truce in the middle of it for about 9 years. But for the most part, active fighting between Holland and Flanders. And the reason for this open, active warfare was twofold. One, look where Spain is relative to this region. You got to imagine there's going to be some people who don't like the idea of being governed by people who don't even speak the language. Right? That's part of it. Another part of it is that after the Reformation, the Spanish Netherlands remained Catholic. The United Provinces turned Protestant. As that started to take place, the King of Spain, back in the 16th century, back in 1568, the King of Spain sent troops into the Low Countries to kill the Protestants, many of whom continued to flee further northward. And the reason he did this is the Protestants had been destroying art and churches. Didn't like that. So in an attempt to reassert rule, the Dutch to this day call it the Spanish Fury. Right? The King of Spain sent in troops. And this began the 80 Years' War. Right? This is still being fought through the entirety of Rubens's lifetime. So I brought in a naval encounter between Dutch and Flemish ships down at the National Gallery to illustrate the 80 Years' War. Right? It is finally finished with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Right? But for the first half of the century, 17th century, right, Holland and Flanders are at active war. Okay? A time of warfare. Now, this war will spell the end of Spain as a world power. They invest all of their money fighting Holland, and it just taps them out. So by the end of the 17th century, Spain is no longer the power it had been through much of the Renaissance. Okay? At the same time, Holland becomes really the major seafaring power that it was. This is the time of the Dutch East India Corporation, where the Dutch were the rulers of the high seas, where New York was New Amsterdam, right? This is the height of Holland's power, politically, but also the height of their wealth. It's an incredibly wealthy time for the Dutch. To this day, they call it their golden age. Right? It was never better for them than at this time. And as you might imagine, with all of that money, there's going to be a lot of art being made, even though it's a time of war. Whenever there's a lot of money, you have money for excess things. Right? And what we're going to look at as we look at Dutch art is not only is there a significant amount of art being made in almost every city in Holland, but because there's so much art being made, what we're going to see is that artists who make art tend to specialize in a particular kind of art. Now, they're Protestants, so they don't like sculpture. But paintings are everywhere.
Why do they not like sculpture?
Because of the second commandment, don't make any carved images, right? And also because, there are some sculptures of like civic leaders and whatnot, but they tended to shy away from it. And there's a couple reasons. That's one of them. The other is, this will come up in a second, or maybe on Thursday, is that the Dutch form of Protestantism was Calvinism. They followed the writings of John Calvin. Okay? And Calvinism, as a Protestant sect, is particularly strict, right? And the Dutch Calvinists were actually called Remonstrants. and they were like the strictest part of the Calvinists, right? So with that strictness came a sort of a social prohibition against ostentatious display, right? You can't show off too much. And so if we look at portraits of Dutch people at the time, they're almost always wearing black, like with a ruff, but pretty much just straight black. And what we'll find when we look at Dutch Baroque art is because of Calvinism, because of the Remonstrance within it, Dutch Baroque art is going to be a little bit more calm than the kind of Baroque we saw in the Catholic countries. The flamboyant theatricality, right, is going to be gone. So with this prohibitive mindset, sculpture is too show-offy, right? High Baroque drama is going to be a bit too show-offy. Because they're Protestants, we don't have the need for religious pictures in the same way. They don't do altarpieces. Protestant churches don't have pictures in them on the north. They don't do crucifixes. They do empty crosses, right? So these things temper how art in Holland looks relative to the other Baroque countries, right? So there's still going to be some flamboyance, because it's everywhere, right? But it's going to be watered down a bit compared to what we've been looking at in Spain, Italy, Flanders, next door, right? So here's an artist who specializes as Frans Hals, right? And he does nothing but portraiture. And in this particular case, this is a military company from the city of Haarlem, double A Haarlem, right? Not to be confused with, and that's where New York came from, right? During this height of seafaring power, is named after this Dutch town. And these are the militiamen, the military men, who are sworn to protect Haarlem should there be an outbreak of war in that town. But since war isn't fought every single day, they've commissioned from Frans Hals a portrait of all of the members of the military company. And I see it's 6:15, so we'll pick up with this on Thursday. So Thursday, the first thing we'll do on Thursday is talk about how to research the authors of your articles. And again, it shouldn't be a lot of research, right? It shouldn't take you a lot of time at all, because it's just a little bit about them that you need to find. But we'll talk about how to do that, and then we'll dive back into this and barrel through Dutch Baroque art. Okay?
I have one quick question.
Yep.
I see in the Marian